Hi, this is Ryan with Automatic Comics, and up next we're going to talk about what went on in the comic market last week, and I'm also going to go over an example of a book that's a perfect candidate for restoration removal and regrading, so stay tuned. Alright, so before we get started, please remember to hit that like button and hit the subscribe button if you'd like to see more content like this. Now, quickly before I get started, you might notice something a little different about me. I finally got a haircut. It's been about 15 months since before the pandemic started, and I hadn't gone back in to get a haircut since then. Finally went and did it, so back to my normal shorter hair. Alright, so with that, if you've watched my prior market videos, what I like to do is I review the Heritage auction sale from the prior week, and I look at what's selling in that auction. I pick out a certain number of books, I follow those, and I look at how those books performed to gauge how the market is doing right now. So just a quick recap, I estimate their price, I capture their prior high sale, and then I look at the actual sale this week, compare it to those numbers, and see how the books are performing overall. Now, I've been doing this now for 4 weeks. This is the 4th week, and this week I evaluated 180 different books, and 59% of them went above my estimate, and that's an increase from the prior 3 weeks where I saw about 53% every week, and that obviously means 41% went below my estimate, and which is a decrease from the 47 to 48% that I saw the prior 3 weeks. Now, the other numbers that I look at is I look at the number of those sales that went 20% or more above my estimate. And this week, again, that was a strong number. I saw 29% of those sales that went over 20% above my estimate, compared to 28% last week, 27% the week before, and 20% from 3 weeks back. So we are seeing, at least from what I can tell, continued strength in these sales. Then I also looked at the books that went 20% or more below my estimate, and this week it was just 11%. Last week it was 13, the week before was 17, and the week before that was 13. And so we're seeing an increased strength in these higher sales, and we're seeing less lower sales. At least that's what it looks like looking at this week over week. Now, the other thing that I've been looking at, because I think this is very important to evaluate, is the number of new highs, because that's something that's looking at the strength over a long period of time. And the last 2 weeks, it's been 51 and 49% of those sales have been new highs within their grade, and this week I saw 50%. And so continuing to see that same strength, so a lot of new high sales for these books within their respective grades. So with that, I also like to look at trends that I see, which types of books are experiencing those new highs. And again, this week, the trends went across all ages, but I did see a lot of strength in Marvel again this week. Amazing Spider-Man, again, was very strong, with 13 of the books that I tracked hitting new records. Fantastic Four also had 4 new records, and Strange Tales had 4 new records. Not surprisingly, in issues 169 and 170, which are the first and second appearance of Brother Voodoo, with what I talked about last week with that crazy $21,600 sale for a 9/8 of Strange Tales 169. Now, there were also some strong sales with Tales of Suspense and Tales to Astonish, 2 of those books that I'm going to talk about later in this video. And XMen, again, had 5 new highs, so still seeing some strength in XMen. Now, the other thing that I really noticed this last week was there were a lot of Good Girl art type covers that were having high and record sales. This included a bunch of different titles: Zoot Comics, 7 Seas, Jungle Comics, JoJo Comics, and All Top Comics. So a lot of these Good Girl art, Golden Age type books having high sales. L.B. Cole also is getting really, really strong right now. So a lot of records in Contact Comics and a book called Captain Flight Comics, and I'll be talking about those as well later in this video. Now, last week, DC was really weak on the high sale area, but this week they seem to be coming back. There were quite a few high sales within DC. I saw them in Batman and Detective Comics, as well as All American Comics and All Star Comics, so going back into the Golden Age. The Adams saw a new high sale, as well as Flash and Justice League. So I did see more high sales in DC than I've seen in the prior couple weeks. Now with that, let's get into the high sales for these books. Now there were a lot of cool books that sold this week that had record highs, and so I picked a few more this week than I normally do to talk about. I've got 10 different books I'm going to talk about just because I thought there were a lot of fun ones to go over. And the first one is Amazing Spider-Man #9. This is the first appearance of Electro, and it was a CGC 6.0 that sold for $2,520. Now Amazing Spider-Man, like I said, had a lot of records this week, and this was one of the biggest. And not only is it the first appearance of Electro, I really like that the bag that he's carrying on the cover has a $sign on it. I just think that's so funny. And I had an estimated price of this book of $2,200. So this beat my estimate by 15%, but the prior high was $2,100 on February 6th. Now the reason I think this is a substantial move, even though it's just 15% above my estimate, is that this book had already moved a lot last year going into the beginning of this year because of the news that broke about Jamie Foxx coming back to play Electro. And this book had essentially paused for a little while. It hadn't really been moving because this time last year it had been a $1,000 book. So this is now an increase of 150% in that book. So I think this is a sign that people are starting to show interest again in these Amazing Spider-Man keys, leading up into the potential release of a trailer that might be coming out soon for the upcoming Spider-Man movie. Now, there are some alternatives for this book. The one that I recommend the most is one that I've talked about before, and that's Daredevil #2. It's his second appearance. It's also the second appearance of Daredevil, so it's a great book. And this book had been overlooked for a long time, but it has started to get more expensive since I originally recommended it maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago. And if you can still find an affordable copy of Daredevil #2, I would say grab it, but the price is climbing, with a 4.5 selling for $450 on April 19th and a 5.0 selling for $795 on April 9th. So it's getting more expensive, but if you can find an affordable copy of that book, I would say pick it up, because Amazing Spider-Man #9 is getting really expensive in all grades now. Now the next book, this sale was really shocking to me. This was a CGC 1.0 of Avengers #1 that sold for a record $2,520. Same price actually as that Amazing Spider-Man #9. And this had been a long overlooked Silver Age key. I think because it's not an individual character that it's their first appearance, instead it's the team, it just wasn't given as much respect as a lot of the other big Silver Age first appearances. And I had estimated the price of this book also at $2,200, so it was 15% above my estimate. And that's just because it's been moving up so much recently. Now the prior high was just $1,625 on May 10th, but 0.5s had been having some really big sales. For example, a 0.5 had sold for $1,487 on May 15th, $2,090 on March 28th, and $1,507 on March 25th. So I felt that this 1.0 was just primed to move. Whoever got that book for $1,625 on May 10th just got a steal. Now, a year ago, this book was $900 to $950. So that's an increase of 180%, which is very significant for a book that's this expensive. And I've mentioned this book in some other videos before. An alternative for it could be Avengers #2. It's their second appearance, and since it seems like it's about impossible to get a copy of Avengers #1 for under $1,000 anymore, I think that is a good way to go if you're looking for a more affordable alternative. So Avengers 2 had a 3.0 sale for $375 on April 6th and a 2.0 for under $300. So there are affordable copies out there of that book. Now, one thing though that's been interesting to me with this is that if you look at the next 11 movies that are planned for the MCU, there isn't one that has an Avengers type title in it. And so are they done with this team now? Are they going to revamp it with new characters? Are we going to see them again? We know there's rumors about Young Avengers, but not really the Avengers team anymore. And so I'm curious about that. I don't know if this is something where we're actually going to see that team show up again, or if that's basically done now with the end of Infinity War. So we'll see. It may be that this book is just kind of going up with all the rest of the books in the market, but I'm not so sure on the spec on this book because I just don't see any movies on the schedule right now coming out with that name. Now, like I said, there was strength in DC this last week, and so I've got a DC book right here. We've got Batman number 171 with a CGC 5.0 that sold for $1,020, and this is a record in that grade. It's the first Silver Age appearance of the Riddler, and he is the main villain in the next Batman movie. And we got some pictures or potential pictures of what his costume might look like in the movie. Looks real weird. And so that could have been what's starting to spike this book. Now, I had estimated the price at $800, and this was 30% above my estimate. And this book has been a tough book to price. The prices have really been all over the place. The prior high sale was $860 on May 4th, but a 5.5 sold for $710 on May 3rd, a 5.0 sold for $759 on May 19th. But that was a fixed price listing, so it's possible that the person who listed it just hadn't really been aware of recent sales and priced it a little low. But this was definitely a big sale for that book. Now, a year ago, in this grade, this was just a $375 book, and that's an increase of 170%, which is a big jump for a DC book. Now, there aren't really any great alternatives, in my opinion, for this book. It's already the cheaper alternative of the character's actual first appearance in Detective Comics 140 back in the Golden Age. And if you want to see an amazing copy of that book, go check out the video I did on the Promise Collection Pedigree about a week ago. They have a 9.6 of that book in that pedigree that is coming up for sale next month on Heritage. So just an incredible copy of that book. But back to 171, this is getting to be a more expensive book. A 0.5 sold for $182.50 on April 5th. And so you're probably going to have to spend at least a couple $100s to get into this book. Maybe try to get hold of it raw, but if it's a great Batman villain, I think it's an awesome cover. I love the pink cover of this book. So I think it's one that if you're a Batman fan, definitely got to try to get a copy of this book. I wouldn't really go for an alternative. Now, when I was talking about the trends, I mentioned that there were a lot of strong sales with LB Cole this week, and this was one of them. This is Contact Comics number 6 in a CGC 6.0 that sold for a record $2,400. Now, like I mentioned, there were quite a few strong LB Cole sales this week. You can tell the demand for this artist's books has really been growing rapidly, and especially because Contact Comics had generally been the run of books that I would recommend to someone if they wanted to get into LB Cole for a little less money. They tended to be more affordable, but that changed this week. There were a number of books from that run that sold this week, all setting records, and I believe all of them over $1,000. That included issues 2, 4, 5, and this one, issue 6. Now, this run of books, all of them have basically a World War II theme, more or less, with planes, except for issue number 12. Issue number 12 is a very futuristic sci-fi type cover. And this one, though, has these planes attacking a Japanese boat, has the rising sun flag on the cover, so it does have some elements that make it a desirable cover. But I had just estimated the sale price of this book at $1,200. This was 100% above my estimate, so this was a big sale. Now, this is the highest graded copy on the census. It's not the single highest graded copy, though. There are 4 total copies at this grade, but when you do have the highest graded copy, you can have some unusual sales numbers because people like having that top of the census book. But a 5.5 sold for just $485 in August of 2020, and a 3.5 sold for just $360 on April 2nd. So I had estimated this to be a much higher sale at $1,200, knowing that it was the top graded book on the census, and it still blew those numbers out of the water. Now, there was another LB Cole book that had a really big sale this week. That was Captain Flight Comics number 10. And it had a 7.0 that sold for $3,600, and a 5.5 had sold for just $438 in 2018, and a 6.0 for $287 in 2016. So really, the demand for LB Cole books has just been going up exponentially, it seems, almost every year. Now, I do think that if you want to get into LB Cole books, Contact Comics, Eagle Comics are still great options. Just look for slightly lower grade copies. They are rare though, so you're not going to see them come up for sale very often, but those are the types of books I go for. If you go into the pre-code horror type books or sci-fi type books, you're going to tend to have to spend quite a bit more money. Now, going back into DC again, because like I said, there were some strong sales with DC. We have Justice League #1 with a 3.5 selling for $1,440. It's a book from 1960, and there's not really anything key about this book. I do not like this book. I think it is one of the ugliest covers from the Silver Age, along with Aquaman #1 and Green Lantern #1. I don't know what was going on with DC and their #1 issues, but I think they had some really bad covers in the Silver Age. I mean, they're like, well, let's have these two people playing chess on the cover and everybody else just sitting at a table. Oh, and then to make it even better, let's just make the whole cover gray. It's just, there's nothing really great about this cover, but I think that's why this book has really been pretty cheap for a long time. Now, I had estimated the price at $1,200. This was 20% above my estimate, and $1,200 had been the prior high on this book. There had been a couple sales at this price, within about $5 of that price, one on March 19th, and then one on December 18th of last year. Now, a year ago, this was only a $675 book in this grade, so that's an increase of about 110%. So that's a big jump for this book, which could have been driven by the Justice League movie re-release, the Snyder Cut. I'm not too sure, though. It could just be another example of the increase in the general comic market bringing up all other key books. Now, again, for alternatives, this really is the alternative for this book, because the first appearance of the Justice League, which is a much better cover, is Brave and the Bold #28. And so that's a cover with all the Justice League members fighting Starro, which is actually the villain that's in the upcoming Suicide Squad movie. So that book has been getting a lot of demand around it recently. So if you really want to add this book to your collection, I would just be looking for a low-grade copy of this book. Maybe try to find it raw, but it is a older Silver Age book. There aren't a lot of them out there, so it can be tough to come across. Now, I was really excited when I saw this book hitting a record this week, and this is Strange Tales #89 in a CGC 4.5, sold for $3,600. Now, I love this cover. I have a low-grade copy of this book. Mine's either I think it's a 1.5 or a 1.8, and this is the first appearance of Fin Fang Foom, and he's got a pretty strong cult following. There is a lot of demand for his first appearance, and so it's always been an expensive book, but it has gotten pretty crazy lately. There are some rumors I've heard that he may be in the upcoming Shang-Chi movie, and I was wondering if we might see him in that scene where you see that big battle scene where you have some creatures flying and everything, because he's a dragon, so I thought maybe we might see him in that scene. I have no idea though, but I had estimated the price of this book at just $2,500. This was 44% above my estimate, which is quite a bit for a book that's this expensive. The prior high on this book was $2,640, but that was less than a month ago, just on April 26th, and that was already a huge record from the prior high of $1,600 on November 23rd of last year. So this is a big jump in this book that we've been seeing over a pretty short period of time. Now, it is a relatively rare book for the Silver Age. There's only 357 Blue Label copies on the census, so it doesn't come up for sale all that often. So it's not really a surprise that when it does come up for sale, that with a limited number of copies and the demand for this character, that you do see high prices. Now, a year ago, this was about a $1,500 book with a sale of $1,495 on April 22nd. So that's an increase of 140% in 1 year, which for a pre-hero monster book, that is a big jump in price, especially with no real news with the character. Now, there is a really affordable good alternative for that book, but it is also relatively rare, so it may not come up for sale very often either. It's Strange Tales #87, just 2 books earlier, and this is the first appearance of Grog, and it's actually a prototype character for Fin Fang Foom. So it's not that same character, but a lot of times you will have prototype characters where they're working out the details, putting them in the books, and then they finalize that character in a later book. And that's what this character is, and it is much cheaper than Strange Tales 89. The 6.5 sold on April 19th for just $288, and a 7.5 sold on February 26th for $450. And those books in issue 89 would be $5,000 to $7,000, possibly even more. So that is a very good alternative to that character that you can get into for much cheaper. Now, I'd mentioned I was going to talk about Tales of Suspense, and this one was another big record. This was Tales of Suspense number 50 with a CGC 5.5 that sold for $1,560. Now, this is the first appearance of the Mandarin, and he is definitely spiking because of the Shang-Chi movie. He's playing Shang-Chi's father and looks to be the primary villain antagonist for the movie. Now, I had estimated the price of this book at $1,250, so this was 25% above my estimate. The prior high had been $1,325, but that was just a few days before this sale on May 8th, and that was already a huge jump from the high before that, which was $450 from April 12th of last year. Now, a copy of this book sold for just $440 on December 9th, so this is why I was a bit conservative with my estimate of that value, because it had such a significant jump in price over a very short period of time. Now, this is a relatively rare book for a Silver Age key. There are only 656 Blue Label copies on the census. A year ago, this book was selling for approximately $375, with a low sale of just $270 on May 17th of 2020. So that's an increase of 480% above that $270 sale and 315% above the about fair market value from a year ago. So just a huge jump in this book. Now, personally, I do not recommend picking up this book right now. I've talked about this before. This is a villain, and it has gone up more than most other books recently, and so the likelihood of this book retaining value long term, I think, is relatively low, because usually these villains are either going to be killed off in that movie, or you're only going to see them that one time, and then the interest in that book is going to reduce. So if you really want this book, I wouldn't go for an alternative. I would just wait until after the Shang-Chi movie comes out, see what happens with the price of that book. It will probably come down, and then look for that, add it to your collection, because right now it's basically at its peak price, and I don't see it retaining those kinds of values long term. You never know, we're in a weird market right now, so it's always possible it could keep going up, but that's been my experience in the past, and I would not be paying up for this book right now. Now, I always like seeing this book come up for sale. I think it's an awesome book. This is Tales to Astonish, number 13, in a CGC 5.5. It had one of the most shocking sales of the week for me. This was $7,200. Now, this is the first appearance of Groot, so very popular character now, but this just crushed any prior sale around this grade for that book. I'm not sure what's really causing it, since anything with the Guardians is a little ways off. There's a Disney Plus show coming up based on Groot, but it's kind of like a kid's cartoon is what it looks like, so I don't see that really driving prices all that much. Now, I had estimated the price of this book at $4,000, and this was 80% above my estimate. So like I said, that was a huge sale. The prior high was $3,750, but that was all the way back in May of 2019. But more recently, there had been a $3,120 sale just on December 21st, and a 6.0 had sold for $3,900 on March 16th, and a 5.0 had sold for $3,500 on May 5th. So I think around that $4,000 mark is where that book was really expecting to go. So $7,200 is a huge sale for that book. Now, this is another character that I would be relatively cautious around. Now, not because it's a villain, but because if you look at the price of this book prior to Guardians of the Galaxy, this was a very inexpensive book. Overstreet didn't even break it out as a separate book in their pricing. You know, it was just lumped together with a bunch of books in that time period, and so it really didn't have all that much value. It was similar to the other pre-hero monster books from the time. So if they stop using this character, there's no more Guardians of the Galaxy movies, anything like that, I don't know what's going to happen with the prices of that book. There could be a big retraction in the value of that book. Now, it is a very popular character right now, so it's possible they may try to keep finding ways to use that character and incorporate them into movies, but it's something that I would just be a little wary of with this book. Now, there is a great alternative, though. There's a book called Where Monsters Dwell, number 6, and this is a Bronze Age reprint of this book, of the first appearance of Groot. It only was 10 years later. It's from 1970, and high-grade copies in the 9.4 to 9.6 range can be had for just a few $100s, and in the 7 to 8 range, they're around $100, and even cheaper if you get into lower grade books. So definitely an alternative to that first appearance that you can pick up without having to spend thousands of dollars. Right, now this is the last high sale I'm going to talk about. Then, like I mentioned, I'm going to talk about that book with the restoration. And this is X-Men number 10 in the CGC 7.5 that sold for $1,320. Also a big record. And this is one I wanted to talk about because it was the book that I recommended about 2.5 weeks ago because it looked undervalued. And so I've been saying the market is moving so fast, and so if you identify books that seem undervalued, you really need to go after them because they could be jumping in price very quickly right now. And I had actually been hoping to try to pick up this specific copy, but it went way more than I was comfortable spending on it, so maybe that's the risk of me talking about these books in these videos, but this was a very significant record. I had estimated the price of that book at $900, so this was about 45% above my estimate. The prior high was just $650, and that was on December 26th of last year, and it had sold for $576 as recent as February 1st and $625 on February 2nd. Now, a 7.0 had sold for $785 on March 14th, and a 6.0 sold for $673 on April 10th, so I did think this was a reasonable estimate, so this is a big jump in the price of that book. Now, this was around a $450 book a year ago, so that's an increase of about 195%. So that's getting it up closer to those other keys that I had talked about in that X-Men video that I did a couple weeks ago. So the prices on this book are getting a little higher. They're getting more normalized with the other X-Men keys, but it can sometimes take a little while for one of these sales to pass down to other grades to see the other grades' sale prices change. So it's still possible that you could find copies of this book for a good price. Now, a 3.5 sold for $222 on April 25th, so they aren't cheap. You're still likely going to spend at least a couple $100 for one of these books, but it is a early Silver Age X-Men key, so you should expect to have to pay a little bit of money to get one of these, but this is the book I would go after still. If you wanted a copy, I wouldn't go for any alternatives. Now I want to talk about that book that I said was a good candidate for restoration removal, and this is a pretty cool book. This is Wonder Comics number 1 in a CGC 6.0 conserved. So you can see, if you look at this label, it is a little different than your standard Universal label. It's kind of a gray color to it instead of the blue that you have with Universal, and this is for a conserved book. Now, conserved is just a nice way of saying restored, but it's a very specific type of restoration. It means the restoration was of type A1, so it's professional and a very small amount of restoration, but it also has to be very specific types of restoration. It can't be anything that improves the appearance of the book. And one thing to note with this book, though, is it sold for $4,560. And while I'm not going to say this was a record or anything because it was a restored book versus a Universal book, but a 7.5 of this book sold in May of 2019 for $4,320. So this was a 6.0, so a lower grade and restored and sold for more. Now, this is exactly the type of book you want to look for with a World War II type cover. It has the Nazi flag on it. It has the Japanese Rising Sun flag on it. It has Hitler on it. It has Hirohito on it. It's also an Alex Schomburg cover. And another plus is it's a number 1, so it's the first issue in a run. Now, it is a rare book. There are only 31 total copies, with 23 being blue label and 8 being restored. And like I said, conservation falls under that restored category. Now, the reason this book is such a great option for restoration removal is the actual restoration type. So I'll zoom in on the actual restoration there, and you can see that it's just tear seal to cover and cover and interior reinforced. And the reinforcement could likely be removed without impacting the grade at all. And then the tear seal, if it's an A1, it means that tear is very small, and if you look close around the staple, there's some small tears around the staple, and I'm guessing that's where it is. And so you could have those tear seals removed and it would very likely remain a 6.0. And who knows, with cleaning, pressing, resubmission, you might even get better than a 6.0 with this book as a blue label. So this is the type of book that you really want to go after if you're trying to have restoration removed. You want that professional type of restoration because it can be removed without doing further damage to the book. You want small amounts of restoration so that the book is going to retain as close to that grade as possible and have minimal impact on the appearance of the book. The other reason it's important to have small amounts of removal is that restoration removal can be very expensive. Most places, including CCS, I believe, charge by the hour. So if there is a lot of restoration that has to be removed, it can be a lot of work and it can cost a lot of money. So the less restoration you have to remove, the less it's going to cost, the less it's going to go into that bottom line of the price of the book. Now, the other thing with this book is, you can see it is a beautiful presenting copy. A 6.0 puts it in the top 50% of all the books. So if they can get a 6.0 on resubmission or better, then you're going to have a very nice copy compared to other copies on the census. It's also, you can see it's a white pages copy, which for 1944, for the Golden Age, is a big deal. So these are the kinds of things that you want to look for with the potential of restoration removal. It's good to have a book that is already of high value, so it can take on that cost of having the restoration removed. Small amounts of restoration removal and removal that will have minimal damage to the book. Now, that doesn't mean you have to go for a conserved book. Those are relatively rare. It's also important to look for things that are like A1 or maybe even B1. C1, you can have the restoration removed, but you're going to have damage to that book. So look for those small amounts of restoration and look for the letters like A or B, A being the best one. But I hope you thought this video was useful. If you did, please hit that like button, hit the subscribe button if you'd like to see more content like this, and I will see you in the next video.